So now that we have a good understanding of risk, let's perform a risk assessment example. So here's our scenario. An employee's time and attendance was certified in error based on inaccurate data. As a result, an employee was underpaid. So some questions to ask yourself when performing a risk assessment are: what is the risk? What is the likelihood or impact of this risk? And is it inherent or residual? So what is the risk? In this case, the risk is improperly certifying an employee's time and attendance based on inaccurate data. So, what type of risk is this? This is a financial risk. We're dealing with financial resources and financial reporting. What type of risk response strategy should be implemented? Risk reduction. It isn't risk acceptance. We aren't saying, oh, well, a mistake was made, but I'm not going to make any corrections. We are taking action to mitigate the risk. It isn't risk avoidance. We aren't going to stop entering our time into ERP just because it carries risk. And it isn't risk sharing. We aren't delegating the responsibility to another person or agency. Is it an inherent risk or a residual risk? Well, to be honest, it could be both. It could be inherent, especially when considering human factors. As a human, we're prone to making mistakes. Perhaps someone fat fingered something or forgot to annotate additional hours worked. But even if we put controls in place, perhaps there are still residual risk. ERP is technology after all. Perhaps the system miscalculated or malfunctioned or has some latency or dormancy issues. What is the likelihood or impact of this risk? The likelihood is probably going to be low, especially if internal controls are effective. If the appropriate personnel is reviewing time and attendance entries prior to submission, then we reduce the likelihood of error. The impact or effect to the mission is probably low as well. So now that we have performed our risk assessment, we need to determine what internal controls need to be implemented and whether those controls are effective. And we do this by testing the internal controls. So here are some questions that we need to think about when conducting an internal control evaluation. What type of controls should we consider to mitigate the risk? How do I verify that those controls are effective? And what happens if I place the controls and still have risk? So back to our scenario. What type of controls can we put in place to mitigate the risk? We could have employees do a final check before submitting into ERP. We could have supervisors remind employees to review timekeeping entries for accuracy, or we could have timekeeping officials review entries for accuracy upon certification. One thing that I want to point out is that you can have more than one control for each risk, but you must perform an evaluation for each control listed. And again, this is a way to verify that the controls are effective. As part of your test planning, you must determine your test objective first. So for our risk assessment example, our test objective is to ensure that employee time and attendance is properly recorded and certified. When it comes to testing internal controls, there are four basic concepts. Inquiry, asking people if internal controls are effective. Inspection, this is looking at evidence of control procedure. Observation, looking at controls as they are in operation. And a reperformance, reperforming a control procedure. Now let's test some methods out.